Maria Santos had always been different from other girls in her small village near the border. While her friends dreamed of marriage and children, she dreamed of serving her country. At 23, she was one of the few female intelligence officers in the National Army, a position she had fought hard to earn despite countless rejections and skeptical looks from male superiors. The morning of October 15th started like any other day at the remote military outpost. Maria was reviewing surveillance reports when Colonel Rodriguez burst into the communications room, his face grave with urgency. Intelligence had intercepted enemy communications about a planned attack on a civilian refugee camp, just 12 miles across the border. Hundreds of innocent families, including women and children, were in immediate danger. "We need someone to cross into enemy territory and warn them," the colonel announced to the assembled team. "This is a volunteer mission only. The risks are enormous, and if captured, you'll be on your own." Without hesitation, Maria stepped forward. Her colleagues exchanged worried glances, knowing her reputation for taking dangerous assignments that others wouldn't touch. She had already completed 3 successful reconnaissance missions behind enemy lines, but this one felt different. The intelligence was sketchy, the terrain was unfamiliar, and recent reports suggested increased enemy patrols in the area. "Santos, I need you to understand something," Colonel Rodriguez said privately after the briefing. "If things go wrong out there, we cannot mount a rescue operation. The political situation is too delicate. You'll be completely alone." Maria nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of his words. She had joined the military knowing that some missions came with no guarantees of return. Her father had died serving his country when she was 15, and her mother had made her promise never to follow the same path. But some promises were meant to be broken when innocent lives hung in the balance. Preparation for the mission began immediately. Maria studied topographical maps of the border region, memorizing every hill, valley, and potential hiding spot. The refugee camp was located in a disputed area that had changed hands multiple times during the ongoing conflict. Getting there would require crossing through at least 2 known enemy checkpoints and navigating terrain filled with landmines and patrol routes. Her equipment was minimal to avoid detection: a small radio with limited range, basic medical supplies, energy bars for 3 days, a sidearm with 2 magazines, and civilian clothes to blend in with local populations. The plan was simple: cross the border under cover of darkness, reach the refugee camp by dawn, deliver the warning, and return the same route before enemy forces could mobilize for their planned attack. As sunset approached, Maria sat alone in the chapel on base, something she rarely did despite her Catholic upbringing. She wasn't particularly religious, but facing the unknown always made her reflect on what truly mattered. She thought about her younger brother Miguel, who was studying engineering at university thanks to the money she sent home each month. She thought about her mother, who still lit candles every Sunday praying for her daughter's safety. At exactly 2100 hours, Maria made her way to the departure point near the border fence. The night was overcast, which would provide excellent cover, but also make navigation more challenging. Staff Sergeant Lopez, her closest friend in the unit, handed her a small compass that had belonged to his grandfather. "Bring this back to me," he said quietly, knowing it might be the last time they spoke. The border crossing went smoothly. Maria had memorized the patrol schedules and slipped through a gap in the fence during a guard change. The first 2 hours of hiking were uneventful as she followed a dry riverbed that provided natural concealment from aerial surveillance. Her military training had taught her to move silently through difficult terrain, and years of experience had honed these skills to perfection. Around midnight, she encountered her first major obstacle. A recently established enemy checkpoint blocked the main route to the refugee camp. Through her binoculars, she counted at least 6 soldiers and 2 military vehicles. The detour would add 3 hours to her journey and take her through an area marked as potentially mined on her maps. Maria made the difficult decision to take the longer route. Every minute counted, but getting captured would help no one. She carefully picked her way through the suspected minefield, testing each step and watching for the telltale signs of buried explosives that her training had taught her to recognize. The mental strain was exhausting. One wrong step could end everything. Dawn was breaking as she finally spotted the refugee camp in the valley below. Smoke from cooking fires drifted lazily into the morning air, and she could see people beginning their daily routines. Children played between the makeshift shelters while women prepared breakfast with whatever supplies they had. It looked peaceful, completely unaware of the danger approaching. Maria felt a surge of relief as she approached the camp perimeter. She had made it in time. The warning could be delivered, the families could be evacuated, and hundreds of lives would be saved. She began planning her approach to the camp leadership, knowing she needed to convince them quickly without causing panic. But as she stood up from her hiding spot behind a cluster of rocks, ready to make the final approach to the camp, she heard the distinctive sound of boots on gravel behind her. Her heart sank as she slowly turned around to find herself facing 3 enemy soldiers, their weapons already drawn and pointed directly at her. "Don't move," one of them commanded in accented English, apparently recognizing her foreign features. "Drop your weapon and put your hands behind your head." Maria's mind raced through her options. She could try to fight, but 3 against 1 with automatic weapons meant certain death. She could try to run, but the open ground between her position and the camp offered no cover. As she slowly raised her hands, she realized with growing horror that her capture meant more than just her own fate. It meant the refugee camp would receive no warning of the impending attack. The soldier who had spoken approached carefully while his companions kept their weapons trained on her. He removed her sidearm and radio, crushing the communication device under his boot. As plastic fragments scattered across the rocky ground, Maria watched her only connection to the outside world disappear forever. "You picked a very bad place to go sightseeing," the soldier said with a cold smile as he secured her hands behind her back with zip ties. The enemy soldiers marched Maria away from the refugee camp at gunpoint, her mission now a complete failure. With every step, she felt the weight of hundreds of innocent lives that would soon be in danger. The attack was scheduled for that evening, and there was nothing she could do to warn them now. The soldiers took her to a temporary command post hidden in an abandoned farmhouse about 2 miles from where she had been captured. The building was surrounded by sandbags and camouflaged netting, clearly serving as a forward operating base for enemy operations in the region. As they approached, Maria counted at least 15 more soldiers and several military vehicles hidden under canvas covers. Inside the farmhouse, she was roughly pushed into a wooden chair in what had once been the kitchen. The furniture was old and broken, and bullet holes in the walls told the story of previous battles. A young enemy officer, probably in his early 30s, sat across from her at a makeshift table. His uniform bore the insignia of a captain, and his eyes held the hardened look of someone who had seen too much combat. "I am Captain Volkov," he said in careful English. "You're going to tell me everything about your mission, your unit, and your military's plans in this region." Maria remained silent, staring straight ahead. Her military training had prepared her for capture and interrogation. She knew the rules: name, rank, and serial number only. Anything else could compromise operations and endanger her fellow soldiers. Captain Volkov studied her for a long moment before speaking again. "We know you are a spy. We found military equipment in your possession, and your identification papers are obviously forged. This makes you an illegal combatant, which means you have no protection under international law." The threat was clear, but Maria had expected nothing less. She had volunteered for this mission knowing the risks, and she was prepared to face whatever consequences came with capture. What bothered her more than her own situation was the knowledge that the refugee camp would be attacked in just a few hours. "The Geneva Conventions protect all prisoners of war," she finally said, her voice steady despite the fear growing in her chest. Captain Volkov laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "The Geneva Conventions apply to soldiers in uniform representing a recognized military force. You were captured in civilian clothes, carrying false identification, operating illegally in our territory. As far as international law is concerned, you are a spy and a terrorist." The interrogation continued for hours. Captain Volkov alternated between threats and promises, trying every psychological technique to break her resolve. He offered her food, water, and medical attention in exchange for information. When that failed, he described in detail what would happen to captured spies in their prison facilities. Throughout it all, Maria maintained her silence, giving only her name, rank, and service number. As evening approached, the sound of distant explosions began echoing across the valley. The attack on the refugee camp had begun. Maria closed her eyes, trying not to imagine the terror and confusion as families ran for their lives. The guilt was overwhelming. She had been so close to warning them, so close to saving those innocent people. Captain Volkov noticed her reaction to the explosions. "Those are your friends at the refugee camp," he said with cruel satisfaction. "If you had cooperated, we might have been willing to call off the attack. Now their blood is on your hands as much as ours." The psychological blow was devastating. Maria had seen combat before, and had learned to compartmentalize the violence and death that came with military service. But knowing that her failure directly led to civilian casualties was something she had never experienced. She fought to maintain her composure, knowing that breaking down now would only give her captors more ammunition to use against her. Late that night, after the explosions had stopped and an eerie silence settled over the valley, 2 soldiers entered the room where Maria was being held. Without a word, they cut her restraints and hauled her to her feet. Captain Volkov was nowhere to be seen, and these soldiers seemed to be operating under different orders. "Move," one of them growled in broken English, pushing her toward the door. They led her outside to a military truck where several other prisoners were already loaded in the back. In the dim light, she could see they were all civilians, men, women, and even a few teenagers who looked like they might be from the refugee camp. Their clothes were torn and dirty, and many showed signs of injury from the attack. As the truck started moving, Maria tried to communicate with the other prisoners despite the language barrier. Through gestures and broken phrases in different languages, she learned that these were indeed survivors from the refugee camp. The attack had been devastating. Dozens killed, many more wounded, and these few had been taken prisoner for reasons unknown. The drive lasted several hours over rough terrain. Maria tried to keep track of their route by memorizing turns and estimating distances, but the darkness and her unfamiliarity with the area made navigation nearly impossible. Eventually, they arrived at what appeared to be a larger military installation, surrounded by high fences and guard towers. The prisoners were processed quickly and efficiently. Maria was separated from the civilians and taken to a different part of the compound. Her new cell was a concrete room barely 6 feet square with no windows, and only a small slot in the metal door for passing food. The only furniture was a thin mattress on the floor and a metal bucket in the corner. For 3 days, she remained in solitary confinement with minimal food and water. Guards came twice daily to slide a bowl of thin soup and a piece of stale bread through the slot in her door, but no one spoke to her. The isolation was deliberately designed to break down her mental defenses before the next phase of interrogation began. On the 4th day, everything changed. Maria was awakened before dawn by the sound of explosions and gunfire coming from somewhere within the compound. Emergency alarms were blaring, and she could hear soldiers running in the corridors outside her cell, shouting orders in their native language. Through the small slot in her door, she caught glimpses of soldiers running past in full combat gear. The facility was clearly under attack, but by whom? Was it her own military mounting a rescue operation? Or was this some kind of internal conflict between enemy factions? The battle raged for hours. At times, the fighting seemed very close to her cell block, and she could hear the distinctive sound of different weapons being fired. She pressed herself against the wall furthest from the door, knowing that a stray bullet could easily penetrate the thin metal. As suddenly as it had begun, the fighting stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving than the battle had been. Maria waited, listening for any sound that might tell her what had happened. Hours passed with nothing but occasional distant voices and the sound of vehicles moving around the compound. Finally, as darkness fell, footsteps approached her cell. The door opened to reveal not guards, but 2 figures in dark clothing with their faces covered. They spoke quickly to each other in a language she didn't recognize. Then one of them approached her cautiously. "American?" he asked in heavily accented English. Maria shook her head. "Military," she replied, hoping they would understand she was a soldier rather than a civilian. The 2 figures exchanged more words, then the first one turned back to her. "Come, quickly. We leave now." Maria hesitated for a moment, unsure if these were rescuers or simply a different group of captors. But her options were limited, and staying in the cell offered no hope of escape. She followed them out into the corridor, where she saw the bodies of several guards and evidence of the fierce battle that had taken place. The 2 masked figures led Maria through the damaged compound, stepping carefully around debris and bodies. The attack had been thorough and devastating. Guard towers were destroyed, vehicles burned, and entire sections of the facility lay in ruins. As they moved through the shadows, Maria began to understand that these were not regular soldiers, but members of some kind of resistance group. Her rescuers communicated only in whispered phrases and hand signals. Clearly experienced in covert operations, they led her to a gap in the outer fence that had been blown open during the attack. Beyond the compound, a battered pickup truck waited in a grove of trees, its engine running quietly. "Get in back," one of the figures instructed, pulling back a canvas tarp to reveal a hidden compartment barely large enough for a person. "Stay quiet, no move. No talk." Maria squeezed into the cramped space and the tarp was pulled back over her. The truck began moving slowly at first, probably to avoid detection, then picked up speed as they got further from the compound. The ride was uncomfortable and disorienting. She couldn't see where they were going, and every bump in the road reminded her of her injuries from the past few days. After what felt like hours, the truck finally stopped. The tarp was pulled back and Maria found herself looking up at a star-filled sky. They were in a mountainous area she didn't recognize, surrounded by rocky terrain and sparse vegetation. A small camp was hidden among the boulders, several tents, a few armed men, and the smell of wood smoke from a carefully concealed fire. The leader of the group, an older man with graying hair and intelligent eyes, approached as Maria climbed out of the truck. Unlike the others, he didn't bother to hide his face, suggesting they were now in relatively safe territory. "I am Commander Hassan," he said in surprisingly good English. "We are part of the local resistance movement fighting against the occupation of our homeland. You were lucky we decided to raid that prison when we did." Maria thanked him genuinely, though she remained cautious. In her experience, being rescued from one enemy didn't automatically make the rescuer a friend. "Why did you help me?" she asked. Commander Hassan studied her for a moment before answering. "We intercepted communications about your capture. You are the soldier who tried to warn the refugee camp. Many of those people were our families, our friends. We honor those who risk their lives to protect innocent civilians, even if they are foreigners." The weight of the failed mission hit her again. Despite her rescue, the knowledge that she had been unable to save those families continued to torment her. Commander Hassan seemed to sense her guilt. "The attack on the camp was not your fault," he said quietly. "We knew it was coming too, but we lacked the resources to evacuate everyone in time. At least some survived because of your warning. The few people you managed to alert before your capture were able to hide and escape." This small comfort helped ease some of Maria's guilt, but she knew she would carry the burden of that night for the rest of her life. Commander Hassan invited her to sit by the fire, where some of the resistance fighters shared their simple meal of bread and vegetables with her. It was the first real food she had eaten in days. As they ate, Commander Hassan explained their situation. The resistance controlled several small areas in the mountains, but they were constantly under pressure from enemy forces. They had limited supplies, outdated weapons, and no outside support. Most of their operations focused on gathering intelligence and occasionally rescuing prisoners or civilians. "We cannot take you directly to your border," Commander Hassan explained. "The entire area is heavily patrolled now after the prison break, but we know routes through the mountains that might get you close enough to make it on your own." Maria appreciated their help, but she also understood the position they were in. These people were fighting for their homeland with limited resources, and helping a foreign soldier get home was not their primary mission. She would need to find her own way back, and the journey would be dangerous. The next morning, Commander Hassan provided her with civilian clothes, a small backpack with basic supplies and a rough map of the mountain passes. One of his men, a young fighter named Dmitri who spoke some English, volunteered to guide her partway through the mountains. "This will take you within 10 kilometers of your border," Commander Hassan said, pointing to a location on the map. "After that, you will be on your own. The terrain is difficult, but it offers good concealment from patrols." Maria studied the map carefully, memorizing the route and identifying potential hazards. The journey would take her through some of the most remote and dangerous territory in the region. There were no towns or villages along the way, just wilderness punctuated by enemy patrol routes and observation posts. She said goodbye to Commander Hassan and his fighters, knowing she might never see them again but grateful for their unexpected kindness. Dmitri led her away from the camp on foot, following ancient trails that wound through the Rocky Mountains. He was an experienced guide who knew every path and hiding spot in the area. For 2 days, they traveled through increasingly difficult terrain. Dmitri taught her which plants were safe to eat, where to find water in the dry landscape, and how to recognize the signs of enemy activity. His knowledge of the mountains was encyclopedic. He had grown up in these hills before the war displaced his family. On the third day, they reached a high ridge that offered a clear view of the valley below. In the distance, Maria could see the border fence and what she hoped were friendly positions on the other side. It was tantalizingly close, but the terrain between their current position and the border was completely exposed with no cover from observation. "This is as far as I can go," Dmitri said apologetically. "My orders are to return to the unit, but you can see your destination from here." Maria thanked him for his guidance and watched as he disappeared back along the trail they had followed. She was alone again, but this time she had a clear objective and at least some supplies to help her survive the journey. She spent the rest of the day observing the valley through binoculars that Dmitri had loaned her. She could see patrol patterns, guard positions, and what appeared to be a minefield marked with warning signs along the border fence. Getting across would require perfect timing and more luck than she cared to rely on. As night fell, Maria began her descent into the valley. The slope was treacherous in the darkness, and several times she had to stop to avoid triggering small rock slides that could alert enemy sentries. Her military training helped her move silently, but the unfamiliar terrain made every step a calculated risk. Halfway down the slope, disaster struck. Her foot slipped on loose shale, and she tumbled uncontrollably down the steep hillside. She tried to stop herself but couldn't find purchase on the rocky surface. When she finally came to rest against a boulder, pain shot through her left leg, and she realized with growing alarm that something was seriously wrong. Attempting to stand sent waves of agony through her body. Her leg was either badly sprained or broken, and continuing the journey would be nearly impossible. She was still miles from the border, with no way to call for help and enemy patrols likely to discover her by morning. As she lay against the boulder, trying to decide what to do next, Maria heard the sound of voices approaching from somewhere below. Peering through the darkness, she could see flashlight beams moving in her direction. Whether they were enemy soldiers investigating the sound of her fall or friendly forces conducting a patrol, she couldn't tell. But discovery now would likely mean the end of her escape attempt. Maria pressed herself against the boulder, trying to become invisible as the voices drew closer. Her injured leg throbbed with every heartbeat, but she forced herself to remain absolutely still. The flashlight beams swept back and forth across the hillside, and she could now make out at least 3 different voices speaking in the enemy language. The search pattern suggested these were experienced soldiers conducting a systematic sweep of the area. They had probably heard her fall and were investigating any potential security threat. Maria held her breath as a beam of light passed just inches from her hiding spot behind the rock. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, the voices began to fade as the patrol moved further up the hillside. Maria waited until she was certain they were gone before allowing herself to breathe normally again. She had avoided immediate capture, but her situation was now desperate. Examining her leg in the moonlight, she could see that her ankle was badly swollen and possibly fractured. Without proper medical attention, the injury would only get worse. More importantly, she couldn't put any weight on the leg without excruciating pain, which meant her chances of reaching the border on foot were virtually zero. But giving up wasn't an option. Maria had come too far and endured too much to quit now. She fashioned a crude splint using branches and strips torn from her shirt, then began the agonizing process of moving toward the border by crawling and dragging herself across the rough terrain. Progress was painfully slow. What should have been a 20-minute walk took her the entire night, and by dawn she had covered less than a mile. Her hands were bloody from crawling over sharp rocks, and exhaustion was beginning to cloud her judgment. She needed to find shelter before the morning patrols spotted her in the open valley. A cluster of large rocks about 100 meters ahead offered the only concealment in sight. Using the last of her strength, Maria dragged herself to the natural shelter just as the first light of dawn illuminated the valley. From her new position, she had a clear view of the border fence, now only about 3 miles away. Through her binoculars, she could see her own country's flag flying over a guard post on the far side of the fence. So close, yet it might as well have been on the moon given her current condition. Enemy patrols were already moving through the valley below, Following the same routes she had observed the previous day, Maria rationed her remaining water and food, knowing she might be trapped in this position for days. The shelter provided protection from observation, but it also limited her mobility if she needed to move quickly. She settled in to wait for nightfall, hoping her leg would improve enough to allow her to continue. As the day progressed, the pain in her leg became increasingly severe. What she had initially hoped was just a bad sprain was clearly something more serious. The swelling continued to worsen, and the improvised splint was cutting off circulation. Without proper medical treatment, infection was becoming a real concern. Around midday, she noticed increased activity near the border fence. Military vehicles were arriving at the guard posts on both sides, and she could see soldiers setting up what appeared to be communication equipment. Something significant was happening, but she had no way of knowing what it meant for her escape attempt. Using her binoculars, Maria tried to read the situation. Were the additional forces there because of her escape from the prison? Had her own military launched some kind of operation to find her? The activity seemed too organized and substantial to be a routine patrol change. As evening approached, she made a decision that went against every instinct of military caution she possessed. Instead of continuing toward the official border crossing, she would attempt to cross at a point where the fence appeared to be less heavily guarded. It was a desperate gamble, but her condition was deteriorating rapidly, and she might not survive another day in the wilderness. The area she had chosen was about 2 miles from her current position, where the border fence ran through a dry ravine. Through her binoculars, she had observed that patrols only passed through this section every few hours, and there were no fixed guard positions nearby. The fence itself looked less formidable here, possibly damaged by erosion or previous incidents. Maria began moving as soon as darkness fell, dragging herself across the valley floor with determination born of desperation. Every foot of progress required enormous effort, and she had to stop frequently to rest and manage the pain. But the sight of her country's flag, visible even in the moonlight, kept her motivated. Halfway to her chosen crossing point, she encountered an unexpected obstacle. A deep irrigation ditch cut across her path, filled with stagnant water and steep banks. In her weakened condition, crossing it seemed impossible. But turning back would add miles to her journey and use up precious time before dawn. She spent nearly an hour finding a place where the ditch was narrow enough to cross. Using a fallen tree branch as a crude crutch, she managed to lower herself into the muddy water and struggle up the opposite bank. The effort left her exhausted and completely soaked, but she was now within a mile of her target crossing point. As she approached the fence, Maria could see that her assessment had been correct. This section ran through rough terrain that made regular patrols difficult, and the fence itself showed signs of damage from weather and neglect. Several of the wire strands were loose or broken, creating gaps large enough for a person to crawl through. But as she prepared to make her final approach to the fence, disaster struck again. The sound of approaching vehicles echoed across the valley, and she could see headlights converging on her location from multiple directions. Somehow her presence had been detected, and enemy forces were moving to intercept her. Maria realized she had perhaps 10 minutes before the search teams reached her position. In her current condition, there was no way she could outrun or hide from a determined search. Her only option was to reach the fence before they arrived, and hope that crossing into her own country's territory would provide protection. Abandoning all attempts at stealth, she began crawling toward the fence as quickly as her injured body would allow. Behind her, she could hear vehicles stopping and soldiers deploying for a search. Flashlight beams began sweeping the area, and she knew they would spot her within minutes. The fence was now only 50 meters away, but it might as well have been 50 miles. Her strength was almost completely gone, and the pursuit was closing in rapidly. She could hear voices getting closer and the distinctive sound of weapons being prepared for action. With one final surge of desperate energy, Maria reached the damaged section of fence and began squeezing through a gap in the wire. The metal strands tore at her clothes and skin, but she felt the incredible relief of crossing onto her own country's soil. She had made it, but her ordeal was far from over. On the other side of the fence, she collapsed from exhaustion and pain. Her country's border guards would find her eventually, but would they reach her before the pursuing enemy soldiers decided to ignore the international boundary? As consciousness began to fade, Maria could hear voices approaching from both sides of the fence, and she wasn't sure which would reach her first. Maria's consciousness drifted in and out as she lay collapsed on her home country soil. Through the fog of pain and exhaustion, she could hear heated voices arguing in multiple languages near the border fence. The enemy soldiers had reached the boundary but couldn't cross without creating an international incident. The first person to reach her was Sergeant Carlos Mendez from her own country's border patrol. She felt gentle hands checking for injuries and heard his voice calling for medical assistance on his radio. Through half-closed eyes, she could see his concerned face leaning over her, and for the first time in days, she felt truly safe. "Easy there, soldier," Sergeant Mendez said softly. "You're home now. We're going to take care of you." An army medic arrived within minutes and began treating her most serious injuries. The makeshift splint on her leg was carefully removed, revealing an ankle that was severely swollen and discolored. Cuts and scrapes from crawling across rough terrain covered her hands and arms, and dehydration had left her weak and disoriented. As the medical team worked, Maria tried to explain her situation to Sergeant Mendez. Her voice was barely a whisper, but she managed to convey that she was a military intelligence officer who had been captured behind enemy lines. The sergeant listened carefully, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. "We need to get you to a hospital immediately," the medic announced after completing his initial assessment. "That ankle needs surgery, and you're showing signs of infection from several of these wounds." A military helicopter was called to evacuate Maria to the regional medical center, a modern facility equipped to handle combat injuries. As the aircraft lifted off, she looked down at the border fence growing smaller below and felt an overwhelming sense of relief mixed with sadness for all that had been lost. During her mission, the next few days passed in a blur of medical procedures, debriefings, and visits from military officials. Maria's ankle required 2 surgeries to repair the damage, and the infection in her wounds kept her on strong antibiotics for over a week. But slowly, her body began to heal, even as her mind struggled with the emotional aftermath of her experience. Colonel Rodriguez arrived at the hospital 3 days after her rescue, his usually stern demeanor softened by obvious relief at seeing her alive. He brought news that her family had been notified of her safety, after being told she was missing in action for over a week. "We never stopped looking for you," the colonel said, settling into a chair beside her hospital bed. But the diplomatic situation made it impossible to mount an official search and rescue operation. "How did you manage to survive and escape?" Maria recounted her story, from the initial capture through her time with the resistance fighters and her eventual solo journey to the border. Colonel Rodriguez listened with growing amazement, occasionally shaking his head at some of the risks she had taken and decisions she had made. "The refugee camp?" she asked when she finished her account. "What happened to the survivors?" Colonel Rodriguez's expression darkened. "The attack was devastating. 37 people were killed, including 12 children, but intelligence reports suggest that many more would have died if some hadn't received advance warning to hide in the surrounding hills. Your mission wasn't a complete failure, Maria." The news was bittersweet. Knowing that some lives had been saved provided comfort, but the guilt over those who had died would stay with her forever. She realized that this was part of the burden that came with military service. Sometimes success was measured not by what was accomplished, but by how much worse things could have been. Physical therapy began as soon as her ankle surgery healed enough to allow movement. The injury had been severe, and doctors warned that she might never regain full mobility in that leg. For someone who had built her career on physical capabilities, this was a devastating prognosis. But Maria approached rehabilitation with the same determination that had carried her through enemy territory. She pushed herself through painful exercises, gradually rebuilding strength in her damaged ankle. Progress was slow and frustrating, but she refused to accept limitations on her recovery. During the long hours of physical therapy, she had time to reflect on her experience and what it meant for her future. The capture, imprisonment, escape, and desperate journey home had changed her in ways she was still discovering. Simple things like sleeping in a safe bed or eating a hot meal took on new significance after days of uncertainty and deprivation. News of her escape and survival began to spread within military circles. Other intelligence officers came to visit, eager to hear first-hand accounts of enemy operations and capabilities. Maria found herself becoming an inadvertent expert on resistance movements and survival techniques in hostile territory. The resistance fighters who had rescued her also gained recognition through her reports. Intelligence services began exploring ways to provide support to Commander Hassan's group and other similar organizations fighting against the occupation. Maria's experience had opened new possibilities for cooperation and mutual assistance. After 2 months in the hospital and rehabilitation facility, Maria was finally cleared to return to active duty. Though with restrictions on the types of assignments she could accept, her ankle had healed better than expected. But she would never again have the physical capabilities required for the most dangerous infiltration missions. Colonel Rodriguez offered her a position in training and analysis, where her experience behind enemy lines would be valuable for preparing other intelligence officers. It was important work, but Maria struggled with the transition from active field operations to a desk job. The nightmares began about 3 months after her return. Images of the refugee camp attack, memories of her cell in the enemy prison, and recurring dreams about being hunted through unfamiliar terrain disrupted her sleep and affected her concentration. Military counselors diagnosed her with post-traumatic stress disorder, a common condition among combat veterans. Treatment for PTSD required Maria to confront painful memories and emotions she had been trying to suppress. Therapy sessions were difficult and emotionally draining, but gradually she began to understand how her experiences had affected her mind as well as her body. The breakthrough came during a group therapy session with other combat veterans. Listening to their stories, Maria realized she wasn't alone in struggling with guilt, survivor's remorse, and the challenge of readjusting to normal life. For the first time since her return, she felt understood by people who had faced similar trauma. One veteran, a former prisoner of war named Lieutenant Torres, became particularly important in her recovery. He had spent 8 months in enemy captivity and understood the complex emotions that came with survival when others hadn't been as fortunate. His friendship and guidance helped Maria develop coping strategies for dealing with her symptoms. "Survival isn't something to feel guilty about," Lieutenant Torres told her during one of their conversations. "The people who didn't make it wouldn't want us to carry that burden. They'd want us to live fully and make their sacrifice meaningful." These words resonated deeply with Maria, helping her reframe her experience in a more positive light. She began to see her survival not as a failure to save others, but as an opportunity to honor those who had been lost by continuing to serve and protect innocent people. Her work in the training division took on new meaning as she developed programs to better prepare intelligence officers for capture and survival situations. Using her first-hand experience, she created realistic scenarios that tested not just physical skills but mental resilience and decision-making under extreme stress. The refugee camp survivors had been relocated to a settlement within her own country's borders, and Maria made it a point to visit them regularly. These meetings were emotionally challenging but also healing, as she was able to see the families who had escaped the attack and were now rebuilding their lives in safety. One of the survivors, an elderly man named Abdul who had lost his wife in the attack, became a close friend. Despite the language barrier and the tragedy they shared, they found comfort in each other's company. Abdul's resilience and dignity in the face of loss inspired Maria and helped her understand that healing was possible even after the most devastating experiences. "You carry honor," Abdul told her through a translator during one visit. "You risked everything for people you didn't know. This makes you family to us." 6 months after her return, Maria received unexpected news. Commander Hassan, the resistance leader who had helped her escape, had been captured during an enemy offensive against his mountain stronghold. Intelligence reports suggested he was being held in the same prison facility where Maria had been imprisoned. The irony wasn't lost on her. The man who had saved her life was now in the same desperate situation she had escaped from. Military officials approached her about providing intelligence for a potential rescue operation. Given her unique knowledge of the facility and the local terrain, Maria didn't hesitate to volunteer for the mission planning team. Despite her physical limitations and the obvious psychological challenges of returning to the area of her capture, her intimate knowledge of the prison layout, guard routines, and escape routes made her invaluable to the operation's success. The mission was being planned as an international operation, involving special forces from multiple countries and coordination with other resistance groups in the region. It was ambitious and dangerous, with many of the same risks that had made her original mission so perilous. As Maria worked on the rescue plans, she felt a sense of purpose returning that had been missing since her injury. This was a chance to repay the debt she owed to Commander Hassan and his fighters, while also potentially saving other prisoners being held in the facility. The operation was scheduled to launch in 2 weeks, and Maria found herself counting down the days with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She wouldn't be participating directly in the rescue due to her physical limitations, but she would be coordinating intelligence and communications from a command post near the border. Her ankle ached constantly now, a permanent reminder of her previous ordeal. But her spirit felt stronger than it had in months. The helplessness she had experienced during her captivity was being transformed into action that could save lives and strike back against the forces that had caused so much suffering. As she prepared for the mission, Maria reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning when she had volunteered to warn the refugee camp. The naive confidence of her youth had been replaced by a deeper understanding of the costs of war and the complexity of serving others. But despite everything she had endured, her commitment to protecting innocent people remained unshaken. If anything, her experiences had strengthened her resolve to fight against injustice and oppression wherever she encountered it. The scars on her body and mind were permanent, but they had also made her stronger and more determined than ever before. The mission was being planned as an international operation, involving special forces from multiple countries and coordination with other resistance groups in the region. It was ambitious and dangerous, with many of the same risks that had made her original mission so perilous. As Maria worked on the rescue plans, she felt a sense of purpose returning that had been missing since her injury. This was a chance to repay the debt she owed to Commander Hassan and his fighters, while also potentially saving other prisoners being held in the facility. The operation was scheduled to launch in 2 weeks, and Maria found herself counting down the days with a mixture of anticipation and dread. She wouldn't be participating directly in the rescue due to her physical limitations, but she would be coordinating intelligence and communications from a command post near the border. Her ankle ached constantly now, a permanent reminder of her previous ordeal. But her spirit felt stronger than it had in months. The helplessness she had experienced during her captivity was being transformed into action that could save lives and strike back against the forces that had caused so much suffering. As she prepared for the mission, Maria reflected on how much her life had changed since that morning when she had volunteered to warn the refugee camp. The naive confidence of her youth had been replaced by a deeper understanding of the costs of war and the complexity of serving others. But despite everything she had endured, her commitment to protecting innocent people remained unshaken. If anything, her experiences had strengthened her resolve to fight against injustice and oppression wherever she encountered it. The scars on her body and mind were permanent, but they had also made her stronger and more determined than ever before. The rescue operation began exactly as planned under cover of darkness. Maria monitored communications from the command post, her heart racing as she listened to the Special Forces teams moving into position around the prison facility. Through encrypted radio channels, she could hear the calm, professional voices of soldiers implementing the strategies she had helped develop. Alpha team in position at the north gate, came the first report. Perimeter guards neutralized. Bravo team approaching the main compound, followed moments later. No signs of increased security since last intelligence update. Maria's detailed knowledge of the prison layout proved invaluable. She guided the teams through corridors she remembered from her own captivity, helping them avoid patrol routes and locate the most likely holding areas for high-value prisoners like Commander Hassan. The operation proceeded smoothly for the first 30 minutes. The teams had successfully penetrated the facility and were systematically clearing cell blocks, releasing prisoners and documenting enemy intelligence materials. Maria felt a surge of satisfaction as reports came in of dozens of prisoners being freed, including several resistance fighters from Commander Hassan's group. Then everything went wrong. Contact! Contact! Crackled over the radio as automatic weapons fire erupted in the background. Enemy reinforcements approaching from the east. Heavy resistance at the main cell block. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Intelligence had failed to detect a large enemy patrol that was returning to base, just as the rescue operation was underway. What had been designed as a quick surgical strike was turning into a prolonged firefight, with uncertain outcomes. "Charlie team, we need immediate extraction for wounded," came an urgent call. 2 men down requiring medical evacuation. Maria found herself reliving her own helplessness during the refugee camp attack, watching as another carefully planned mission fell apart despite everyone's best efforts. But this time she wasn't a passive observer. She was coordinating communications and could potentially influence the outcome. "All teams, this is Control," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the chaos she was hearing. "Fall back to secondary extraction point. Abort prisoner search and focus on getting everyone out safely." "Negative, Control," came the reply from the team leader. "We've located Hassan. He's in the maximum security block, but he's in bad shape. We can't leave him." Maria faced an agonizing decision. Military protocol demanded that she order the teams to withdraw before casualties mounted further. But abandoning Commander Hassan after he had risked everything to save her felt like a betrayal of everything she believed in. "Team leader, what's your assessment of extraction feasibility?" she asked. "Difficult but possible," came the reply. "We need 5 more minutes to reach Hassan and get him mobile. But enemy reinforcements will be here by then." The decision went against every principle of tactical planning, but Maria made it anyway. "Proceed with Hassan extraction. All other teams provide covering fire and prepare defensive positions." For the next 10 minutes, the radio filled with the sounds of intense combat as the rescue teams fought their way to Commander Hassan's cell, and then back toward the extraction point. Maria coordinated air support and medical evacuation while tracking the movement of enemy reinforcements on her tactical display. "We have Hassan," finally came the report she had been praying for. "He's conscious but weak. Moving to extraction point now." The helicopters arrived just as enemy reinforcements reached the prison compound. In a chaotic firefight that lasted only minutes but felt like hours, the rescue team successfully extracted with all personnel accounted for, and 17 liberated prisoners, including Commander Hassan. During the flight back to friendly territory, Maria finally allowed herself to feel the enormous relief of a successful mission. Through her headset, she could hear the medical team working on Commander Hassan, whose condition was serious but stable after weeks of imprisonment and interrogation. When the helicopters landed at the field hospital, Maria was there to meet them despite her limited mobility. Commander Hassan was conscious enough to recognize her as he was carried off the aircraft on a stretcher. "My friend," he whispered in English, reaching out to grasp her hand briefly. "You kept your promise." Maria hadn't realized she had made any promise, but she understood what he meant. By helping to rescue him, she had repaid the debt she felt she owed for his assistance in her own escape. More importantly, she had proven to herself that her experiences hadn't left her broken or incapable of serving others. The successful rescue operation marked a turning point in Maria's recovery and career. Her combination of field experience and analytical skills made her invaluable for planning similar operations, and she was promoted to lead a new unit specializing in hostage rescue and prisoner extraction missions. Over the following months, she planned and coordinated several more successful operations, each one building her confidence and sense of purpose. The nightmares gradually became less frequent, and the guilt over the refugee camp attack evolved into a driving motivation to prevent similar tragedies. Commander Hassan recovered from his injuries and returned to leading resistance operations in his homeland, now with better equipment and intelligence support facilitated through Maria's unit. Their friendship, forged in shared adversity, became a symbol of how cooperation between different groups could achieve what neither could accomplish alone. A year after her original capture, Maria received an unexpected honor. She was awarded her country's highest military decoration for valor, recognizing not just her survival and escape, but her continued service despite the physical and psychological challenges she had overcome. The ceremony was attended by many of the people who had played roles in her story: Colonel Rodriguez, the resistance fighters who had helped her escape, survivors from the refugee camp, and fellow veterans who understood the true cost of her service. Even Abdul, the elderly refugee who had become her friend, was present to witness the recognition. "True courage," the general said during the presentation, "is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to serve others despite that fear." Maria Santos embodies the finest traditions of military service and reminds us all why we wear the uniform. As Maria stood at attention, the medal heavy on her chest, she thought about how much her definition of success had changed. The failed mission to warn the refugee camp had once seemed like her greatest failure, but it had led to experiences and relationships that had made her a better soldier and a stronger person. Her ankle still ached in cold weather, and the memories of her captivity would never completely fade. But these reminders of her ordeal had become sources of strength rather than weakness. They connected her to the people she served and motivated her to ensure that others wouldn't have to endure what she had experienced alone. In the months that followed, Maria continued her work planning rescue operations while also speaking to military academies and training centers about survival, resilience, and the importance of never abandoning hope even in the darkest circumstances. Her story became part of the curriculum for intelligence officers, not as an example of failure, but as proof that determination and courage could overcome even the most desperate situations. The refugee camp survivors had established a new community in their adopted homeland, and Maria visited regularly to help with integration programs and cultural exchange initiatives. These visits reminded her constantly that military service was ultimately about protecting people and preserving the possibility of peaceful, normal life for families and communities. Commander Hassan's resistance movement eventually succeeded in liberating their homeland, and he was elected to lead the new provisional government. One of his first official acts was to establish a monument honoring all those who had died in the refugee camp attack, including Maria's name among those who had tried to prevent the tragedy. 5 years after her capture and escape, Maria was promoted to colonel and given command of an entire intelligence division. Her experiences had taught her that leadership required not just tactical knowledge but empathy, resilience, and the willingness to take calculated risks to protect others. She never forgot the lessons learned during those desperate days behind enemy lines. That survival required both physical and mental strength. That help could come from unexpected sources, and that the mission to protect innocent people was worth any personal sacrifice. Standing in her new office, looking out at the flag that had guided her home through so many dark nights, Maria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had been left to die in enemy territory, but she had refused to fall. More importantly, she had found her way not just back home, but to a deeper understanding of what home truly meant. Not just a place, but a commitment to the values and people worth fighting for.